5 wives in 25 years, all young, all healthy, all driven to the brink of madness in the same bedroom. It was the sort of fact polite Charleston society learned to keep out of conversation, a black mark smoothed over with careful euphemisms, tragic circumstances, delicate nerves, sudden decline. But in the city's back alleys and servant quarters, the whispers never stopped. They called it the room that eats women. Some said the Hartwell mansion was cursed. Others claimed its master carried something unholy in his blood. But those closest to Jeremiah Hartwell, the ones who had served in his house, cleaned his rooms, carried trays to the wives who refused to eat, knew it wasn't a curse. It was a system. And the proof of that system lay in a leather-bound journal kept hidden in the locked drawer of Hartwell's desk. A book he never let the servants touch, and which Margaret, his second wife, once claimed smelled of damp stone and old iron. The journal was no ordinary record. It was part diary, part experiment log, every page a meticulous account of what the woman in the glass had told each wife, and how Hartwell had turned those whispered illusions into chains around their minds. The entries were clinical, cold, dated, and cross-referenced. March 12th, E reports the glass warns of the East Corridor, reinforced by removing candles from that hallway after dusk. Ensure she sees a servant refuse to pass there at night. April 3rd, increase isolation, deny her request for garden walks. She asked the glass why. The glass told her the roses hide insects that burrow into the brain. She now refuses to open windows. May 21st, her reflection now appears altered to her eye. Slight warping in left mirror seam enhances effect. She told the maid the woman is more present now. To Hartwell, these were not the ramblings of madwomen, they were progress report. As the mirror woman wasn't a ghost haunting his wives, she was a tool, a voice Hartwell could control without ever speaking a word. Elena's name appeared in the journal too, her descent mapped with the same surgical precision, the first appearance of the glass woman, the first night she obeyed an order the reflection had supposedly given her, the first time she chose the reflection's advice over Hartwell's, only to find that his own desires conveniently aligned. Each wife's section ended with a final note written in the same hand, underlined twice, unfit for further progression, transfer to attic room, replace with next subject. Hartwell never explained what transfer meant, but the staff knew. The attic room was locked, always, and the women who went there were never seen at dinner again. Elena didn't know it yet, but her name would eventually find its place at the bottom of one of those pages. The only question was when, and in Hartwell's mind, even that was not left to chance. The journal's final columns were reserved for predictions, the exact month and day he expected a wife to break, and disturbingly often, he was right. Hartwell's hidden journal was not stored in a desk drawer or a locked cabinet. It was sealed inside the east wall of his study, accessible only through a narrow slit in the wood paneling, a slit disguised as a natural grain in the timber. The book inside was bound in worn black leather, its pages thick and yellowed with age, though the handwriting was sharp and deliberate. Each entry was dated, each name written with care. The earliest page bore the year 1829 and the name Margaret Dunlop Hartwell. Initiation: Margaret had been barely 19 when she arrived at the Charleston estate. A merchant's daughter from Savannah, she was drawn to Hartwell's reputation for refinement and his ability to speak of books and philosophy as though they were living things. She thought she was marrying a man who would protect her. The journal showed otherwise. In his first notes, Hartwell described her fascination with the great gilded mirror in their bedchamber. "She glances into it when she thinks I am not watching," he wrote. "A natural vanity, but also an opportunity. I shall encourage it." At first, it was harmless, or so it seemed. Hartwell began to reposition furniture so that her line of sight would always fall upon a reflective surface, a silver tray, a polished cabinet door, the mirror over the mantel. He praised her when she lingered before them. When she caught her reflection and smiled, he would stand behind her, watching her watching. This became what Hartwell later called the watching habit. Margaret would spend longer and longer at her dressing table, smoothing her hair, though it needed no smoothing, adjusting a collar that sat perfectly. She had begun, Hartwell noted, to check for approval in the glass before she turns to me. The journal pages grew darker as months passed. Hartwell introduced subtler manipulations. The infinite corridor effect with the opposing mirrors, the shifting of angles so that her reflection seemed to lean toward her. At night he encouraged her to keep a candle by her bed in case she needed light, knowing the flicker would make the mirrored figure seem to move on its own. Margaret's first recorded break came during a spring dinner party in 1831. The journal spared no detail. March 12th. She stared past the guests into the pier mirror at the far wall and smiled as though someone had spoken to her. When addressed, she did not answer until touched on the arm. Guests noticed. I excused her with mention of fatigue. She returned later, pale and compliant. Witnesses later recalled how Margaret had gone silent mid-conversation, her eyes locked on the mirrored surface, lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. One guest, a physician, whispered that it looked as though she were receiving instruction. After that night, the watching habit became an obsession. She requested that more mirrors be brought into the house, claiming she liked how they made the rooms feel alive. Hartwell's journal entries turned clinical, almost surgical. April the 2nd. Encouragement stage complete. Transition to directive stage. The woman in the glass will begin to suggest changes to her routine. I will place cues accordingly. Margaret would not last another full year before her mind was fully entwined with the reflection's voice, though Hartwell's journal reveals he had planned her descent almost to the day from the moment she arrived. It was Margaret who taught Hartwell the most important lesson of all. When you feed the reflection long enough, it starts eating on its own. Elena's descent had been gradual, obedient, almost graceful in its surrender, but Margaret had fought it, and in fighting, she revealed something Hartwell hadn't anticipated. It began on a night the servants would later call the night of stripped walls. The house had been silent for hours when the sound of tearing, long, ragged shreds echoed through the eastern corridor. Hartwell, candle in hand, found Margaret on her knees in the master suite, ripping the expensive French wallpaper from the plaster with a violence that seemed almost inhuman. Her fingernails were split and bleeding, her nightdress torn at the shoulder. "I need to see what's underneath," she gasped when he demanded an explanation. Her voice was thin, almost childlike. She wouldn't look at him. Her eyes kept darting to the mirror across the room, where her own reflection seemed to lean forward, watching. Hartwell's mind ticked like a clock. What had the woman in the glass told her? By morning, the once elegant walls were naked, streaked with gouges where Margaret had scraped past the plaster, as if searching for a door no one else could see. Hartwell restored the room, of course, but the damage was deeper than paint or paper. Margaret had started pacing at night, standing for long stretches in front of the largest mirror in the house, whispering in bursts, then pausing, listening, nodding. Her agitation grew in one particular disturbing pattern. Whenever the mirrors were covered for cleaning or repair, Margaret's body would stiffen, her hands curling into claws. The servants tried it once, draping a sheet over the vanity glass while she bathed, and she erupted, screaming, thrashing, hurling the porcelain basin across the room. "Don't blind her! Don't you dare blind her!" she shouted, spittle on her lips, her face red with fury. It wasn't herself she was protecting, it was the other woman. Hartwell wrote about it in the small black journal he kept locked inside his study desk, the same desk with the false drawer only he could open. He recorded everything with clinical precision. Day 142, subject refuses sustenance until reflection is uncovered. Day 150, subject reports hearing instructions to remove wallpaper, claims she says the house is hiding something. Day 167, subject enters violent fit upon removal of mirrors, speech fragments, blinding, punishment, below the east wall. The journal was more than a record. It was a blueprint. Hartwell could now predict the exact point at which resistance collapsed into full dependency. For Margaret, it came just shy of the 6-month mark, the point where her fear of losing the reflection outweighed her fear of what the reflection was telling her. Her collapse was spectacular, She stopped leaving the master suite. She would eat only if seated where she could see herself. She began speaking of the other side, as if it were a place she might visit, if only the wall between them could be removed. And then came the final break. One morning, the staff found her in the east corridor, pressing her face flat against the glass of a tall cheval mirror, weeping. "She's gone quiet," Margaret whispered. "I think she's waiting for me there." 2 days later, Hartwell arranged her commitment to the Mount Auburn Asylum. The papers cited hysteria and violent delusions. Hartwell's name appeared only once, in the signature line of the husband requesting her permanent care. The mirrors in her room remained untouched for weeks after her departure. Hartwell didn't cover them, he didn't move them. He wanted the next wife to see what Margaret had seen, because the reflection was never really gone. By the spring of 1835, Eleanor's days belonged to the woman in the glass. But Hartwell's nights belonged to something else entirely. His journal. It wasn't a diary in the sentimental sense. There were no expressions of longing, no tender recollections of courtship or shared laughter. This was an architect's blueprint. Each page was a step-by-step record of his wife's mental unraveling, catalogued, measured, and compared to the patterns of the women before her. At the back of the leather-bound volume, in cramped and angular handwriting, Hartwell had written a name, Margaret, 1833. That was where it began. Margaret's death had been officially recorded as a sudden wasting illness. The neighbors accepted it, the servants whispered their own theories, but the truth was quieter, colder. She had simply stopped. Eating, speaking, looking at anyone but her own reflection. Hartwell never called a doctor. By the time the priest was summoned, she was gone. If her passing broke his heart, he never showed it. In fact, it seemed to sharpen him. Those who knew him before 1833 remembered a man of controlled passions, prone to intensity but still touched by charm. After Margaret, the warmth was gone. What replaced it was calculation. It was in the months after her burial that he sealed the master bedroom. The heavy oak door was fitted with a lock visible only from the outside, the key kept on a silver chain around his neck. No one entered except the wife, and only at night. During the day, Hartwell would pace the hallway outside like a sentry guarding a prison. He began to spend long hours in his study, a narrow room on the second floor lit by a single window. The walls were lined not just with scripture and classical histories, but with imported works from Europe, treatises on mesmerism, early studies of hysteria, accounts of Parisian doctors who claimed to map the mind alone, like a cartographer charting coastlines. He ordered these books at great expense, some in French or German, languages he could barely read but was determined to decipher. One in particular became his obsession, a paper published in Vienna that claimed reflections were a tool to access the subconscious mind. Hartwell annotated it heavily, underlining passages about self-dialogue and dissociation. The journal began to mirror the structure of these studies. Each wife was listed like a case file. Margaret, 1830-1833, initial resistance, avoided eye contact with mirror woman, progressive withdrawal, fatal final stage, voluntary silence. Elena, 1834, susceptible to suggestion, engages willingly with reflection, rapid compliance with environmental modifications. Beneath each name were dates, symptoms, and small marginal notes in which Hartwell recorded the mirror woman's instructions, not as something he told them, but as if she were an independent agent issuing her own commands. In truth, these commands were always ceded by him. A phrase overheard, an object deliberately misplaced, a whisper through the east wall corridor at 2 a.m., so faint it could be mistaken for one's own thoughts. But in the journal, Hartwell described these interventions clinically, as though writing for an audience that might one day replicate his results. April 1835. Elena hesitates to enter dressing room after dark, possible suggestion from subject's reflection about shadows now active. Will reinforce avoidance by ensuring candle missing from room tomorrow. The more he wrote, the more the journal ceased to be a record and became a plan. A day-by-day descent laid out in ink before it ever unfolded in reality. And all of it began with Margaret. Her death hadn't made him retreat from the world, it had made him double down. Where others might have been haunted, Hartwell weren't as intrigued. Where others might have sought comfort, he sought patterns. In the quiet of his locked study, Jeremiah Hartwell was no longer a grieving husband. He was a scientist, and the master bedroom was his laboratory. Section 4. The entries began on December 14, 1834, just 3 weeks after Jeremiah Hartwell married Elena. The handwriting was crisp, deliberate, and almost obsessively neat. Every date was underlined twice. Every paragraph began with her name. Elena. Day 1. Mirrors installed. 6 total. 3 full-length, 2 above the mantel, 1 embedded in wardrobe. Arranged to elongate perspective, distort proportions subtly. The infinite corridor effect is flawless. Subject expressed admiration for the brightness of the room. She does not yet understand she is inside a device. Hartwell's hidden journal was kept behind a false back in the master bedroom's east wardrobe, the very one Elena was instructed never to open. The book wasn't just a record, it was a blueprint of her mind's slow collapse. Day 9. Subject now spends mornings at vanity without prompting, observes her own eyes at length, speaks to herself softly. I do not correct her. Left silver brush slightly misaligned on table. Subject noticed and replaced without hesitation. She is beginning to look for changes. It was all there, every calculated step. He recorded which words the woman in the glass should feed her that week, and which physical cues he would plant in her environment to reinforce them. Day 23. Introduced story of Margaret, not by name. Reflection warned her of shadows in eastern corridor. Subject refused to enter east wing after dusk. Perfect. Margaret, his first wife, had also avoided the eastern corridor, though she had never been told why. Hartwell wasn't merely recreating history, he was refining it. By February of 1835, the journal's tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more possessive. Day 62. Subject asked Reflection if I am pleased with her. Reflection instructed her to remain silent at dinner unless addressed. Subject had complied without hesitation. It wasn't enough for Elena to hear the mirror woman's voice. Hartwell wanted that voice to replace her own reasoning. Each instruction was a small surrender, socially invisible, but psychologically irreversible. When guests visited, Elena still sparkled. She laughed, charmed, and carried conversations with effortless grace. But Hartwell's journal revealed that every gesture, every compliment, every choice of word was pre-approved by the glass. Day 84. Reflection told her I dislike lilacs. Subject removed them from parlor without my asking. Servants informed. They will replace with roses weekly. The journal was an anatomy of control, not blunt force, not public humiliation, but a constant, invisible rearranging of her private reality. And then, the first cracks appeared. Day 97. Subject reports the reflection sometimes moves when she does not. Very good. Hartwell knew that stage well. It meant Elena was seeing the second delay. That fraction of a heartbeat when the reflection seemed to hesitate before following. Margaret had reached that point too. It was the stage where the woman in the glass became more than a voice. She became other. What followed in the journal was the blueprint of her descent, planned down to the day, where she would hesitate, when she would begin waking in the night, the exact date she would refuse to sleep unless the mirrors were covered. Day 103, subject covered mirrors with shawls after midnight. Servants instructed to remove them before dawn. Repetition will erode her will. And Hartwell, meticulous, patient Hartwell, never once forced her hand. He simply let the woman in the glass tell Elena what she was already beginning to believe, that she was never alone in that room. The shift was almost imperceptible. At first, Elena's reports about the mirror woman had been curious little asides over breakfast. She says the curtains in the dining room are hung too high, or she told me the silver should be polished every Thursday, not Friday. Harmless, even charming, in the way young wives often bring unusual ideas into an old house. But now, there was a weight to her words. She began speaking of the woman in the glass, not as a novelty, but as a confidant. "She understands me," Elena told Hartwell one night as they sat in the lamplight, her voice hushed, as if the woman could overhear. "She says the house listens, and that she's teaching me how to speak so it will listen back." Hartwell hid his satisfaction behind a measured smile. The conditioning was advancing faster than it had with Margaret. Elena's willingness to believe was like kindling. It caught fire easily, needing only the smallest spark. And then one morning, she mentioned Margaret by name. "She warned me about the other Mrs. Hartwell," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the mirror as she brushed her hair. "She says I should never, ever walk where Margaret walked after sundown. She says Margaret still lingers here." Hartwell stilled, the brush in his own hand pausing mid-air. This wasn't part of his planted cues. The name Margaret had not been introduced into Elena's world by him. Not yet. "Elena," he asked carefully, "what else did she tell you?" "That Margaret didn't listen," Elena said. "She refused to follow the rules, and the house punished her for it. She says I won't be punished, as long as I obey." The words hit him like the faint echo of his own design, only sharpened. The mirror woman was no longer just his puppet. Or perhaps she never had been entirely his. The system of cues, the reflections, the psychological traps. They had begun to weave their own narrative, independent of his hand. That night, after Elena was locked safely in the master suite, Hartwell descended to the study and pulled a narrow, leather-bound ledger from a locked drawer. This was not the public household account book, the one servants occasionally glimpsed. This was his journal. Inside, each wife had her own section, a page for their arrival date, a page for the first mention of the mirror woman, a page for each escalation in behavior. He turned to Elena's section and wrote, Week 9. First spontaneous mention of Margaret without prior stimulus. Compliant. Trust in reflection voice increasing. Belief in punitive house spirits established. Recommend introducing rule set A by end of month. The journal was methodical, even cold. It was part experiment log, part psychological blueprint. Every hallucination, every small paranoia, every obedience was recorded like data. And as he closed the book, Hartwell realized something. Margaret had reached this point too. The last entry in her section was dated only a few days before she'd vanished. The handwriting was sharper there, more urgent. Week 12. Resistance growing. Reflection voice recommending separation from subject. Possible contamination. Possible contamination. Hartwell set the journal back in its drawer and locked it tight. Upstairs, Elena was still talking softly to the mirror. Her voice rose once, as if asking a question, and then fell to a whisper again. She had already crossed the threshold. The mirror woman was no longer a guest in the glass. She was the one running the household now. Hartwell never interrupted Elena's conversations with the glass. He didn't scold her. He didn't question her. He didn't even pretend to be concerned. Instead, he wrote. The locked drawer in his study contained a ledger bound in black calfskin, its pages neat, unhurried, almost surgical in their precision. Each entry was dated, each line numbered, as though he were recording the results of a laboratory trial rather than the disintegration of a human mind. March 14th, Mirror B, North Wall, triggered subject response after 17 minutes, 42 seconds. Subject reports, the woman standing closer than usual. Subject startled but compliant. March 19th, Mirror A, Vanity, suggested subject rearrange nightstand. Subject complied within 4 hours. No resistance noted. March 26th, Mirror B again. Subject warns servants not to cross East Hallway after dusk. Source of warning, the woman. The subject was Elena. The trial mirrors were identified by letters, not locations, so if anyone stumbled across the journal, they wouldn't understand its meaning. But Hartwell knew exactly which mirror was which. He tested them in shifts, first the vanity glass in daylight, then the long mirror in the north wall at dusk, and finally the infinite reflection corridor late at night. He wanted to know which light, which hour, which angle produced the most pliable state of mind. The results fascinated him. Mirror B, for instance, worked best between 6:45 and 7:15 p.m., just after the lamps were lit, but before the sun had fully disappeared. The dimming natural light made the glass appear deeper than it was, and Elena's pupils dilated in a way Hartwell recorded with almost forensic detail. Every change in her behavior was logged: what she moved, what she avoided, what she repeated aloud after her conversations. Sometimes she would forget these interactions within hours, only to obey their instructions days later without knowing why. Hartwell didn't panic when Elena began skipping meals or when she stopped asking to leave the house. He simply wrote, April 2nd, subject now refuses front parlor entirely. Cause, mirror, C, advised avoidance. Marked as compliant. What became clear, chillingly clear, was that this wasn't random cruelty. He was testing something. There was an underlying hypothesis, one we weren't yet privy to, but it lurked between the lines of his entries. Test duration of sustained influence without reinforcement. Test contradictory commands and measure compliance. Test escalation. Hartwell wasn't watching a wife lose her grip on reality. He was measuring it. The rate, the slope, the exact day the last thread would snap. And as the pages turned, the language grew colder. Elena was no longer the subject in his notes. She was S2. Margaret had been S1. The implication was obvious. This had been done before. By the summer of that year, Eleanor's whispers to the glass had grown more frantic, more urgent. The woman had stopped speaking in idle curiosities about the house. Now she was issuing warnings. She says the mirrors aren't just showing things, Elena told Hartwell one morning over breakfast, her eyes darting to the polished silver coffee pot, as though it too might hold a reflection she feared. She says they're doors. Hartwell concealed his satisfaction behind a slow sip of coffee. The idea had taken root. The seed he had planted months earlier, the notion that the mirrors might be more than mere glass, had blossomed into full conviction. Elena now believed there was something on the other side, and she wasn't entirely wrong. 2 nights later, she refused to sleep in the master bedroom. It's in there, she insisted to the maid, her voice trembling. Not the woman, it, the thing she serves. She claimed she could feel it pressing against the walls when the lamps were out, a slow, rhythmic pressure like breathing. What Elena didn't know was that Hartwell had made sure she would feel exactly that. In a locked drawer in his study, behind a false panel only he knew existed, sat a stack of leather-bound journals. They weren't accounts of business transactions or polite correspondence. These were blueprints of madness. Each book was dedicated to a single wife. Inside were columns of dates, times, and carefully recorded triggers. Small changes to the environment Hartwell had orchestrated to draw his subject deeper into the experiment. A warped floorboard loosened just enough to creak at irregular intervals. A hidden copper tube behind the wall, designed to carry the sound of a slow, hollow thump from the attic into the master suite. A brass weight inside the frame of the east mirror that caused the slightest, almost imperceptible shift when the temperature in the room changed. Hartwell called them environmental suggestions. Elena, and Margaret before her, called them hauntings. One page from Elena's journal was more meticulous than the rest. Across the top, in Hartwell's tight clinical script, it read, Phase 3, Awareness of Presence. Beneath it, a list, Night 34. Increase hallway draft via west vent, Night 38. Adjust wall resonance. Attic panel, Night 43. Mirror tilt, 2 degrees forward, Night 45. Introduce breathing cycle. 12-sec interval. This was not random cruelty. Hartwell was measuring something, a threshold. He wanted to see how long it would take before the mind, deprived of outside input and immersed in controlled stimuli, created not just an imaginary companion, but an imaginary predator. What fascinated him was Elena's insistence that the presence was tied to the master bedroom itself. She said it couldn't follow her into other rooms, only watch from within the mirrored walls of that one chamber. And Hartwell, in the quiet of his study, would smile at that. She had taken the bait completely. What she called a presence was nothing more than physics and suggestion, yet in her mind it had weight, it had breath, it had intent. And Hartwell wasn't finished. By the end of that spring, Hartwell no longer needed to guess what the mirror woman was telling Elena. He knew, because every word was already written. In the locked bottom drawer of his study desk, bound in cracked leather and sealed with a brass clasp, was Hartwell's private journal. It was not a diary in the ordinary sense. It was a script. Page after page he had outlined the stages of descent for each wife before she ever took her first step into the mansion. Margaret's section was written in neat, deliberate ink. Her triggers, her fears, the objects that would draw her into the mirrors. Eleanor's section was fresher, more fevered, as if the pen itself had been moving faster than the mind controlling it. And in the margins, Hartwell had begun adding notes like a conductor marking the tempo of a symphony. Day 127. Introduce geometry. Day 130. Increase mirror corridor time to 3 hours. Day 134. Plant the idea that the house is watching her. It was on day 127 that the mirror woman told Elena something that Hartwell had been saving for weeks, a seed he knew would split her sense of reality down the center. The house, she whispered through the glass, was not built to keep you safe. It was built to shape you. Elena blinked, leaning closer. Shape me how? The reflection's lips curved, but did not answer directly. Instead, she began to describe the mansion's bones. The precise angles of its rooms, the way certain corridors bent just enough to throw off your sense of direction, the peculiar placement of mirrors so that every significant corner reflected another. Elena had no architectural knowledge, but she began to feel it, as though the house itself were an instrument tuned to a frequency she could not hear but could feel pressing against her mind. The geometry, the woman in the glass finally said, is not for beauty. It is for influence. Every wall, every doorway, every shadow. It is designed to make you agree. That night, Elena could not sleep. She counted the tiles on the floor, traced the ceiling beams with her eyes, and began seeing invisible lines running through the air, converging at points that felt almost magnetic. She whispered to herself that it was nonsense, that houses didn't think. But every time she caught her reflection, the woman in the glass was smiling, as if she knew Eleanor's denial wouldn't last. Hartwell's journal for that week showed no hesitation. His notes shifted from careful observations to commands. Day 132, restrict outside contact further. Day 133, allow her to find the east corridor alone. She will feel followed. Day 135, mention compliance in conversation. Watch for physical response. And so the walls began to close in, though they did not move an inch. Eleanor's walks through the mansion became shorter. She avoided certain rooms without understanding why, and she began speaking less to the staff, not because she distrusted them, but because the mirror woman told her they were under the geometry's sway too. Hartwell intensified the sessions. More hours at the vanity, more silent meals where the only sound was the clink of silver against porcelain and the constant awareness that somewhere, in some perfectly calculated angle of glass, she was watching. By midsummer, Elena had stopped asking questions. She only listened, and that, in Hartwell's method, was the point where the real shaping began. The transition from curiosity to ritual happened so quietly that even Elena didn't notice. One day she was speaking to the woman in the glass because she wanted to. The next, she was doing it because she had to. Hartwell saw the shift instantly. It was in the way she straightened her posture before approaching the mirror, in the way her voice softened to a whisper, as though speaking in a sacred place, in the way her hands stayed perfectly still, resting on the vanity, afraid to break whatever spell bound her reflection. This was exactly the moment he had been engineering. The conversations were no longer random. They had structure now, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every morning, Elena would greet the woman, confess her thoughts from the previous day, and receive precise instructions for the one ahead. Every evening, she would return to the glass, recount what she had done, and await judgment. Hartwell was recording all of it. Behind the locked doors of his study, in a black leather-bound journal with no title, he kept meticulous notes. Each entry was dated. Each wife had her own section, and beside each wife's name, Hartwell drew the same symbol, a simple oval, like the outline of a mirror, with a faint slash down the center. Under Elena's name, the pages read like a ledger of the soul. March 4th. Mirror advises she rise earlier. Obeyed. Smiled at breakfast. March 12th. Mirror warns against crossing parlor after sunset. Obeyed. Remained in East Hall until morning. March 29th. Mirror hints he is watching more closely. Obeyed. Voice trembling tonight. And the further you read, the more the journal began to resemble a script rather than an observation log. Hartwell wasn't just documenting what the mirror woman said, he was deciding it in advance, inserting objects, sounds and shadows into the environment so that Elena's mind would discover them natural. And this was the perfection of his method, because Elena wasn't the first, and she would not be the last. Margaret before her had followed the same path: fascination, trust, dependence, surrender, but with imperfections. Margaret questioned too often, noticed inconsistencies, resisted the subtler manipulations, so Hartwell adjusted. When she was gone, he applied the corrections to Elena. And when Elena was gone, he would refine it further with the next. It wasn't murder in his mind, it was iteration, a series of controlled trials, each wife a new subject, each woman in the glass more convincing than the last. By this point, Hartwell's experiment had transformed into something more dangerous than a private obsession. It had become a system, a pattern so well rehearsed it could run like clockwork until the subject reached the breaking point. And that's where you, the viewer, come in. Because if you've followed this far, you've already seen the blueprint of manipulation, repetition, isolation, false authority, and self-enforced obedience. If you're ready to see hidden systems for what they are, not just in Hartwell's world, but in yours, comment, "The glass remembers" twice right now. It might seem like a small act, but it's the first crack in the mirror. By the time Lillian arrived in the spring of 1838, Hartwell's methods were refined to the point of artistry. She was younger than the others, barely 21, with the polished manners of a steel magnate's daughter and the delicate posture of someone who had never been told no. Her father's fortune had bought her everything, but it was Hartwell who promised her importance. He didn't start with her the way he had with Elena. There were no gradual rearrangements, no slow dripping of strange instructions. This time, he didn't need to. Lillian was curious by nature, and the mirrors sensed it, or rather, Hartwell knew how to make her believe they did. On her first night in the master suite, Lillian remarked on the arrangement. "Odd," she said, tilting her head at the infinite reflection corridor. "It feels like there's someone just out of sight, past the last reflection." Hartwell only smiled. "Perhaps you'll meet her." The journal, the one he kept in the locked cabinet of his study, details exactly how fast she began to slip. Page after page of dates and observations written with the precision of a surgeon. April 14th. Elle watched mirror for 12 minutes straight this morning. Her breathing slowed, pupils dilated, smiled at nothing. April 15th, Elle asked if the reflection's eyes seemed bluer than her own. I said nothing. April 17th, first secret revealed. She told Elle about the ivory cameo in her mother's locked drawer. Impossible knowledge. Elle frightened but returns to mirror after tea. The secrets were the hook. Hartwell had learned that personal revelations, facts the subject could not possibly know, accelerated dependency. With Elena, the woman in the glass had whispered history. With Lillian, she whispered gossip. Intimate confessions about her family, her friends, her fiancé before Hartwell. By the second week, the entries in Hartwell's journal were chilling, in their detachment. April 23rd. Elle wept after mirror revealed father's mistress in Pittsburgh. No denial. Asked me if it could be true. I advised best not to ask. She clung to me afterward. Desirable outcome. April 25th. Elle now sits before mirror twice daily without prompting. Recorded session length, 41 minutes. He never interfered. He didn't have to. The mirror woman was her own captor now. By May, Lillian was visibly thinner, her meals half finished. The servants whispered that she spoke in her sleep, carrying on conversations no one could understand. Hartwell recorded it all, sometimes adding small annotations, tone pleading or tone fearful, like a scientist tracking a specimen's decline. And then came the incident. May 19th, Elle reported Mirror told her about the locked stair behind the east wall. Detail matches Elena case file. Elle refused to enter the east hallway after dusk. Hartwell's notes turned almost giddy. This was the earliest any wife had reached what he called the turn, the moment when the Mirror woman's voice shifted from confidant to authority. By June, the entries grew shorter. He no longer needed to write what was said, only the effect. June 2nd, session length 63 minutes, L unresponsive to maid for remainder of afternoon. June 4th, L no longer questions instructions, avoids my touch unless instructed otherwise. She had declined in less than 2 months, faster than Margaret, faster than Elena, and Hartwell, ever the patient conductor, simply let the music play. By the time Eleanor's voice had taken on that hushed, trance-like cadence when speaking to the woman in the glass, Hartwell knew the pattern was holding. Every twitch, every hesitation, every small, fearful glance over her shoulder, they all matched the progression he had documented before. He kept his journal in a locked walnut case inside his study, its brass clasp worn smooth from years of handling. No one, not even the senior servants, had ever seen the inside. It was here, under the heading Experiment Number 7, Elena, that his latest observations sat in neat, slanted script. Day 14. Subject begins acknowledging secondary presence without prompting, avoids eye contact with physical companions, prefers visual contact with reflection. Day 18. Subject expresses trust in the reflection over trust in self. Day 25. First compliance with indirect instruction from reflection. Desired behavioral shift achieved ahead of schedule. Every wife had a similar section. Margaret, Lillian, Sarah. Each entry was a careful mixture of behavioral notes, sketches of mirror placement, and something far colder, timelines. Hartwell could now predict, almost to the day, when a subject would begin to unravel, and when they would finally give themselves over entirely. This was the heart of what Hartwell privately called the Hartwell hypothesis, that mirrors, placed and angled under certain environmental conditions, could become more than passive reflectors. They could become instruments, not to simply unsettle the mind, but to direct it. His notes were meticulous. Lighting was critical. Mornings bathed in cold, indirect sun to accentuate pallor, evenings lit by oil lamps positioned low to cast uneven shadows across the face. The room temperature mattered too. A constant slight chill, enough to make the skin prickle without ever allowing true comfort. Isolation was key. No prolonged social interaction, no grounding in reality beyond the glass. And the mirrors themselves. Hartwell had spent years experimenting with beveled edges, silvering thickness, and even slight imperfections in the backing. One misplaced blemish could ruin the effect. One perfect flaw could accelerate it. He was convinced now, certain, that this environment could produce controlled mental collapse in otherwise stable subjects. The mind, given no other anchor, would attach itself to the reflection, and the reflection, once imbued with suggestion, could guide the subject to any belief, any fear, any action. Elena was simply the latest proof. Still, Hartwell was not careless. In the margins of his journal, next to Elena's entries, he had drawn small diagrams marking the control points, moments when he would deliberately insert a command through environmental suggestion. Control point. Day 32. Instruct subject to avoid east wing after dark. Control point. Day 47. Suggest servant. Mary is untrustworthy. Monitor reaction. Control point. Day 53. Begin transferring decision-making to reflection entirely. The chilling part wasn't that Hartwell could bring about this collapse. It was that he could stop it. By reversing the environmental conditions, introducing warmth, disrupting mirror placement, flooding the subject with external social contact, he could halt the progression and even restore stability. But he never did. Because restoring them was never the point. By the close of spring, Elena had crossed the threshold he called full binding. The reflection's voice was the only one she trusted, and Hartwell's notes shifted tone from clinical observation to strategic planning. The experiment was over. The control had begun. By the time Elena's mind had fully unraveled, Hartwell no longer needed to experiment with her. She had become the proof he wanted, that the woman in the glass could replace a wife's own voice. But proof wasn't enough for a man like him. Proof was only the foundation. What he wanted was refinement. And so, when Elena's illness reached the point of no return, she was quietly removed from the mansion. The staff was told she had taken a trip to the countryside to recover. No one ever saw her again. 6 months later, Hartwell married again. This one was different. Younger, bolder, less docile. Her name was Isabel, and she had eyes that didn't look away when he spoke. At the wedding reception, she even teased him about his habit of staring into mirrors before answering a question. Hartwell smiled at her audacity, but privately, he began making adjustments. Isabel's wing of the mansion was arranged with even greater precision than Elena's had been. The mirrors were larger now, and some were altered subtly, their silver backing scraped in specific patterns so that faint distortions appeared when viewed at certain angles. Hartwell didn't just want Isabel to hear the woman in the glass. He wanted her to see things too. For the first year, Isabel showed no signs of succumbing. She laughed easily, hosted small gatherings in defiance of Hartwell's preference for seclusion, and insisted on keeping fresh flowers in every room, something that annoyed him more than he admitted. The woman in the glass, it seemed, could not compete with a mind this self-possessed. Then, in the autumn of 1844, the change began. It was the staff who noticed first. Whenever Isabel entered a room with a dusty mirror, the storage parlors, the unused guest chambers, she would pause, staring at her reflection for long stretches. Then, using the tip of her finger, she would trace shapes into the dust. Not words, not letters, shapes. At first, they were simple, triangles, squares, intersecting circles, but over the months they grew stranger. Complex spirals with perfect spacing, jagged starbursts, interlocking hexagons that looked less like decoration and more like blueprints. Hartwell, intrigued, began preserving them. He instructed the servants never to clean the mirrors she touched. At night, when Isabel slept, he would walk the halls with a candle, copying each drawing into his journal. Beneath every sketch, he recorded the date and any odd behavior Isabel had shown that day. His notes from this period are chilling. November 3rd, 1844. Hexagon with small triangles at each vertex. She refused to eat meat today, said, "It clouds the glass." January 19th, 1845. Spiral of 13 turns. She laughed when no one was in the room. When I asked why, she said, "She told me a joke you wouldn't understand." April 7th, 1845. Shape resembles an eye within a triangle. She refused to enter the East Hall after sunset. Drew the same shape on 2 separate mirrors without remembering the first. Hartwell wasn't entirely sure what the symbols meant, but he knew they were not random. The woman in the glass had changed her tactics. No longer whispering commands, now teaching. Isabel never spoke of the drawings directly. When Hartwell asked, she would feign confusion, or worse, genuine surprise, as if she didn't remember making them at all. By the spring of 1845, the symbols began to appear in places without dust, carved faintly into the wood of her vanity, scratched into the condensation on her bathing mirror. Hartwell's journal entries became shorter, more urgent. The drawings were becoming harder to catalogue before they faded. And then, one morning in August, the mirrors in Isabel's chamber were gone, not removed, shattered, every piece collected neatly into a single pile in the center of the floor, with one final diagram etched into the wood beneath. A perfect, unbroken circle. Isabel was gone. Hartwell's hidden journal was not kept in his study or locked away in a desk. It was stored in a false panel inside the wardrobe of the master bedroom itself, as if he wanted it to share the same air as the women he wrote about. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a dull brown, but the handwriting was meticulous, every line evenly spaced. Each entry was labeled with a date and a name. Elena's name appeared often, but so did Margaret's. And one more, written with a heavier hand, the pen strokes darker and more deliberate. Isabel. Hartwell's notes on her were different. The tone was less clinical, more agitated. She had been his second wife, married in the summer of 1829, and she lasted less than a year in the house. The entries begin innocently enough. Observations about Isabel's softened compliance after long hours in the mirror room, her reduced appetite, her willingness to avoid certain hallways at night. Hartwell writes that she has begun referring to the space behind the east wall in casual conversation, as though it is an ordinary part of the house, but by the 4th month his tone shifts. She claims the chamber watches her. She does not mean this metaphorically. Hartwell notes that Isabel will stand frozen in the bedroom at odd hours, facing the east wall, head tilted slightly as if listening to something on the other side. She told him once, without prompting, that it blinks when you move. He dismissed her words, but in his journal he underlined them twice. By winter, her behavior had worsened. She woke screaming, insisting that the chamber's occupant had leaned through the wall while she slept. She began refusing to use the vanity, claiming the woman in the glass and the watcher in the wall were not the same. The reflection smiled, she said. The wall did not. Hartwell's handwriting becomes almost feverish at this point, filling the marge. Sins with sketches of the room's layout, including the concealed service corridor that ran behind the east wall. He makes no mention of entering it himself. Instead, he writes that her fear is the fuel, the final stage before collapse. The collapse came in early spring. Isabel's final breakdown was not quiet. The journal records it in unnerving detail. March 17, 1830, 1:12 a.m. Isabel clawed the plaster from the east wall until her fingernails bled. She screamed that she could see its eyes through the cracks. Servants restrained her. She bit one hard enough to draw blood. She did not sleep the rest of the night. She asked me to kill her before it does. By morning, Hartwell had summoned a physician he trusted, one who would sign the necessary commitment papers without questions. Isabel was taken to a private asylum in New Haven. Hartwell wrote that he visited her once 2 weeks later, only to find her staring into a corner, whispering to something that wasn't there. The entry ends abruptly. The house has claimed her. The mirrors keep her. The wall remembers. Hartwell's hidden journal began with a sentence that made Catherine's blood run cold the first time she read it, though she would only discover it years later, long after the damage had been done. The difference between a mirror and a man is that the mirror never lies, unless you teach it to. Tucked behind the false back of his desk drawer, bound in cracked calfskin and stained with what looked like tea but wasn't, the journal was a meticulous ledger of every wife's decline. Each entry was labeled with a name, a marriage date, and a chilling subtitle: Initiation, Containment, Collapse. For Elena, the mirror woman's influence had been a gradual infection. For Margaret, it was quicker, almost surgical. But by 1848, when Hartwell married his 5th wife, Catherine, there was nothing gradual about it. Catherine wasn't just another wife. She was Hartwell's perfect subject. From the moment she stepped into the house, the mirrors were already positioned for her, not adjusted after she arrived, waiting for her. Hartwell had spent months studying her habits from a distance before their engagement, which side she preferred to sleep on, how often she checked her own reflection when nervous, the kind of stories that made her shiver in candlelight. In the journal's first page under her name, Hartwell wrote, Day 1. Primary objective. Induce dependency on the glass immediately. Minimize outside influence. Restrict correspondence within first week. Introduce voice by end of week 2. This was the part that made Catherine unlike the others. He wasn't waiting for the mirror woman to appear naturally. He was engineering her arrival from day 1. Servants were given new instructions. Never linger in Catherine's presence unless spoken to, never contradict her observations, and most importantly, always refer to the master suite as hers. Hartwell wanted her to believe I pay. It was not just a room, but a kingdom where only she and her reflection ruled. Within 72 hours of her arrival, Catherine's schedule was altered. Her daily walks in the garden were reduced to short, supervised strolls. The parlor, where she might have spoken with guests, was kept locked unless Hartwell was home. The staff was rotated so that no single maid spent more than 2 days in her service, breaking any chance of personal rapport. Then came the first seed. A letter appeared in her dressing table, folded into the frame of her vanity mirror. It was unsigned, written in a looping feminine hand. "You're not the first to stand here. I see you. I know what he wants, and I can help you survive it." Catherine asked her husband about it, but Hartwell merely frowned and claimed ignorance. The maids denied any knowledge, yet by the next evening another note appeared, this time instructing her to move the chair 3 inches to the left so she could see the truth more clearly. And she did. Hartwell's journal recorded it all with chilling precision. Day 5. Subject complied without hesitation. Facial expressions indicate curiosity outweighs suspicion. Day 8. Began asking questions to the glass directly. Day 11. Referring to the presence as her without prompting. By the second week, Catherine was spending hours alone at her vanity, the servants hearing her murmur things like, "Yes, I understand," and "I'll remember." Hartwell's notes became almost giddy in tone, documenting her responses to subtle manipulations. A tilted candlestick, a covered mirror in the hallway, the removal of her favorite shawl without explanation. The voice in the glass had become her confidant, and Hartwell was writing the script. What Catherine didn't know, what no wife had ever known, was that in the shadows behind her bedroom wall there was a narrow space just wide enough for a man to stand, and Hartwell had been standing there more often than she realized. By the time Elena's voice had thinned into whispers and her gaze lingered more on the glass than on her own husband, Hartwell was ready to move to the next phase, the one that would, in his mind, prove once and for all that madness could be crafted like architecture. The journal was never meant to be found. Bound in deep green leather, with its spine worn smooth from years of use, it was kept inside a false compartment beneath the desk in his study. Even the key was a decoy, a polished brass one that fit nothing, hanging on a hook in plain sight. The real latch could only be opened by pressing a hidden sequence of panels along the desk's edge, a design Hartwell had borrowed from an 18th-century French clockmaker's manual. Inside each page was a blueprint of someone's unraveling. Margaret, Elena, and now, Catherine. For every wife, the journal held 3 columns. The first listed the date and time of each episode. When they had spoken to the woman in the glass, when they had refused food, when they had cried without cause. The second column was a verbatim record of what the mirror woman had told them, as relayed by the wife herself, and the third column was Hartwell's own assessment. Effectiveness, moderate. Emotional stability, declining. Suggest further exposure. Catherine's entries were different. She was cleverer than the others, slower to trust the reflection. Hartwell noted her resistance with something between irritation and fascination. But the turning point came on a rainy night in April when Catherine told him the woman in the glass had stopped speaking in the second person, you, and begun using the first person plural, we. Hartwell's pen scratched the page with unusual urgency. Shift achieved, identity merging, begin full immersion protocol. The full immersion was brutal in its simplicity, no visitors, no letters, servants rotated to avoid. Building familiarity. Catherine's world narrowed to 2 constants, her husband and her reflection. He began introducing inconsistencies, moving objects in the room between her waking and sleeping, altering the angle of the mirrors by a degree so that her face appeared subtly different each morning. On some nights, he would have the servants extinguish all light except the one candle set directly behind her, creating a shadow that appeared not behind her, but within the glass. The journal entries during these weeks took on a fevered tone. Hartwell wrote less like a scientist and more like a zealot. April 23rd. Subject no longer questions reflection's authority, self-reports anxiety when not in mirror's presence. May 1st. Voice in glass instructed her to move her own wedding ring to right hand. Compliance immediate. Emotional reaction, relief. By mid-May, Catherine's language had changed. She began referring to herself in the third person, as if narrating her own decay. "She shouldn't be here," Catherine told Hartwell one night, staring into the infinite corridor of reflections. "She doesn't belong to you anymore. She belongs to us." Hartwell didn't flinch. He simply recorded the exact words in his journal and underlined the final pronoun twice. This was his breakthrough. The moment he believed he had done it, stripped a mind of its singular self and replaced it with an echo that obeyed. To him, this wasn't cruelty, this was the perfection of control. But control is a dangerous illusion, and as Hartwell would learn, the woman in the glass was not his creation. Not entirely. By the time Elena's voice grew hoarse from speaking to the glass each morning, Hartwell's desk drawer was already heavy with ink-stained pages. The journal, bound in deep burgundy leather, the kind used by bankers and magistrates, was locked beneath his writing table. Its key, sewn into the lining of his waistcoat, never left his person. This was not a diary of a doting husband. It was a ledger of human erosion. Every page was meticulously divided into 3 columns: date, stimulus, and observed response. If Elena spent 12 minutes staring into the infinite corridor of mirrors before she began to speak, it was noted. If her tone shifted from defiance to compliance after exactly 23 days of exposure, it was charted with surgical precision. But what made the journal truly unsettling were the initials in the margins, not Elena's and not Margaret's from before her. These were coded monograms: RM, LB, DS, names Hartwell never uttered aloud, and beside them brief notations: received 14th March, packet sent via courier, duplicate for the Institute. Hartwell was not simply tormenting his wives for his own pleasure, he was supplying data. The Charleston Medical Institute, a discreet but very real network of physicians, phrenologists, and government advisors, had been quietly funding private domestic studies for over a decade. Their aim was not treatment, but control, to determine how a human mind could be restructured without the subject ever realizing the process was deliberate. Hartwell's mansion, with its locked rooms and infinite mirrors, had become one of their laboratories. The correspondence was never direct. Instead, Hartwell used a chain of intermediaries: an apothecary in town, a bookbinder who repaired ledgers for local merchants, each of them unwitting couriers. Pages from the journal would be hidden in hollowed-out medical texts, disguised as shipping manifests, or written in a cipher that appeared to be harmless scripture verses. In return, Hartwell received packages containing far more than polite thanks. Custom ground glass lenses from an optical engineer in Philadelphia, designed to warp peripheral vision just enough to make the subject uneasy. Thin sheets of polished tin coated with a mercury amalgam, dangerous to handle for long periods, but capable of producing deeper, more shadowed reflections. And sometimes, most chilling of all, sealed envelopes of advisories from the Institute. Increase verbal reinforcement from the reflection. Introduce sleep deprivation to accelerate compliance. Remove the subject's access to natural light. The language was clinical, almost bloodless, but in practice it meant Hartwell was receiving instructions on how to dismantle a human mind in measured, repeatable steps. What the Institute valued most was his predictability. They knew Hartwell was patient, that he would not rush the process because his satisfaction came not from the breaking itself, but from knowing exactly when and how it would happen. By midsummer of 1835, Elena's section of the journal contained 36 entries marked transmission sent. In the same period, Hartwell had received 6 new advisories, each one tightening the noose. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a small circle of men in expensive coats and white gloves were reading about Elena as though she were a case study, not a living woman, but a specimen. Hartwell had given them exactly what they wanted, proof that an unknowing subject could be guided step by step into obedience, using nothing more than an empty room, a locked door, and a reflection that wasn't real. When Hartwell died in the winter of 1850, the town expected his house to rot quietly, the way old power does when there's no heir to claim it. It didn't. The mansion was sold twice in the decade after his death. Both buyers left within months, citing structural instability and financial strain. But the locals whispered another reason, one that sounded disturbingly like the private torment of Hartwell's wives. Women who visited the property even briefly reported strange experiences. A merchant's daughter swore she saw her own reflection turn its head before she did. A traveling seamstress claimed she heard her mirror image speak, but her lips hadn't moved. A young governess touring the empty halls with a potential buyer was found trembling in the master bedroom, unable to explain why she'd been staring into the far wall for nearly an hour. And then there were the disappearances. They began subtly. A widow from Charleston who'd been in town visiting relatives simply never returned home. Then a pianist from Savannah, last seen walking toward the mansion's gates on a bright afternoon. The sheriff filed them under unsolved transients, but the timing was uncanny. Each had been in the master suite at least once. People began to say the mirrors had memory, that whatever Hartwell had done in life had imprinted itself into the house, particularly the East Wing, and the more you listened to the stories, the more they echoed the accounts of Elena, Margaret, and the others, women who had described being taught by a figure in the glass and whose behavior had subtly shifted until they were no longer entirely themselves. Hartwell's death hadn't ended the experiment, it had simply removed the conductor. But the machinery he had built, the angles, the alignments, the infinite corridors of reflected light and shadow remained, and something in those corridors had learned to run itself. Local boys dared each other to spend a night in the East Wing, but the rules were always the same. You couldn't look into the mirrors after midnight. One boy who broke that rule reportedly woke screaming, claiming the reflection had been smiling when I wasn't. The mansion was boarded up by 1861, just before the war came to Charleston, but it was too late for its reputation. Women who passed it on the street sometimes crossed themselves. Others wouldn't even look at it. Hartwell's journals, the ones detailing his experiments, were never recovered from the house, at least not officially. But in the decades after his death, certain fragments surfaced in private collections, written in his precise, slanted hand. One entry, undated, reads, "She will not know the day I choose. She will think it was her own idea to go, but I will have given it to her piece by piece until she believes the woman in the glass is herself." The implication was clear. Hartwell had planned their descents by the day, and the mirrors had been his instruments. If the rumors were true, those instruments were still in tune, waiting for someone new to play them. When the Hartwell estate was finally abandoned, most believed its secrets had rotted away with the wood. But decades later, during a quiet demolition of the East Wing, a carpenter prying loose the warped floorboards found a narrow iron box, sealed with rust, heavy as stone. Inside lay Hartwell's hidden journals. The pages were dense, written in an unnerving, methodical hand. Each wife's name appeared at the top of a ledger, followed by dates, times, and chillingly precise notes. Elena began compliance on day 42. Mirror recommends reducing light in the study. Margaret expressed suspicion on day 19. Mirror advises increased solitude. Next to the entries were sketches, exact diagrams of the bedroom layouts, every mirror meticulously measured and angled. Hartwell called it the geometry of control. Arrows marked how a subject's line of sight would be funneled towards certain reflections. Shaded areas indicated zones of suggestion, where the subject was most susceptible to the mirror woman's voice. There were also strange mathematical notations, ratios, distances, even calculations tied to lunar phases, suggesting Hartwell believed the mind's receptivity could be amplified under specific cosmic conditions. One set of diagrams mapped the hidden corridor behind the master suite, with annotations about observational nodes, narrow slits cut into the plaster to watch unseen. The most disturbing pages were the final phase instructions: withdraw physical contact, let the reflection become the sole confidant, replace affection with the mirror's approval. When these journals reached the local authorities, they were quietly sealed. Officially, they were irrelevant to the Hartwell estate's legal matters. Unofficially, they were too dangerous. The margins contained not just records, but instructions that, in the wrong hands, could be replicated. And so, Hartwell's geometry of control was buried, not destroyed, just waiting. Hartwell's journal was not a diary in the sentimental sense. It was a ledger, a precise clinical record of cause and effect. Each entry detailed the stimulus he introduced and the resulting behavioral shift in his wives. March 14th. Placed wilted flowers in the room. Elena expressed sadness in the mirror. Woman told her she'd failed in tending to the house. March 22nd. Removed a chair from the parlor. Elena avoided parlor entirely within 2 days. Subject now spending 90% of waking hours in bedroom. Reading those pages, it becomes clear. The woman in the glass was not supernatural. She was a construct, built from environmental triggers, repetitive suggestion, and carefully timed isolation. Hartwell had unknowingly reverse-engineered a formula that modern institutions now use every day. Change the setting from a mansion to a digital screen, and the principle is the same. Replace the mirror with a constant feed of curated images, and the woman in the glass becomes an algorithm. Hartwell understood what marketers, governments, and media outlets understand now. If you can control what someone sees and limit what they hear from anyone else, you can make them believe anything. He didn't need chains to hold Elena. He needed patterns, predictable, invisible patterns. A sudden removal of comfort, a reward for compliance, a repeated whisper of what's safe and what's dangerous. And once that voice becomes the authority in someone's mind, they stop questioning where it came from. You think Hartwell's method was monstrous because it happened in a locked bedroom in 1835. But look around. It's happening in open daylight to millions at once. The only difference? Now the voice doesn't come from a mirror. It comes from the device in your hand. And now, you've seen it.